The longships had fallen silent on the beaches of Scandinavia. No more raids across the North Sea, no more silver flowing back from distant shores. The age of Viking adventure was over, but this wasn't the beginning of peace. It was the start of something far more brutal. While the world remembers the drama of Viking raids, the true darkness began when those warriors came home for good. What replaced the age of adventure was an age of control. Absolute monarchs who turned personal loyalty into state terror. Lutheran priests who became government spies, conducting annual interrogations in every household. A climate that descended into a frozen hell, where entire populations faced starvation every few years. This is the story most people never hear about Scandinavia, the centuries after the Viking Age, when the real horror wasn't a raid that lasted a season, but a surveillance state that lasted centuries. When the greatest enemy wasn't foreign armies, but the killing frost that arrived every winter. When the most dangerous person in your village wasn't a foreign invader, but the priest who reported your thoughts to the king. The Stockholm bloodbath of 1520, where 80 Swedish nobles were systematically executed after a feast that became a massacre. The Finnish famine of 1696, when a third of the population died and parents abandoned children to save themselves. The Great Northern War, which ground up an entire generation of Swedish men in the Russian winter. This is Scandinavian history, stripped of its romantic mythology. No noble Vikings, no cozy social democracy, just the brutal mechanics of state building in a frozen wasteland, where survival demanded absolute submission to absolute power. The last great Viking raid ended not with glory, but with a whimper. In 1066, Harald Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge with an arrow through his throat, and with him died something fundamental about Scandinavian society. The age of the warrior entrepreneur was over. What came next was the age of the warlord king. This transition wasn't peaceful. The same violent impulses that had driven Vikings across the North Sea now turned inward, as petty chieftains consolidated territory through systematic brutality. The difference was crucial. Viking raids had been seasonal, limited, almost entrepreneurial. The new kingdom building was permanent, total, and aimed at control rather than plunder. The mechanics were straightforward. Local strongmen, jarls who had grown rich from Viking expeditions, now faced a stark choice: submit to a more powerful neighbor or be destroyed by him. The era of equals raiding together was finished. Hierarchy was being carved into the landscape with fire and sword. Norway fell under this pattern first. Harald Fairhair had begun the process in the 9th century, but the real consolidation came later, through men like Olaf II, who used Christian conversion as a weapon of political control. The old system of personal loyalty to a war chief was replaced by something more sinister. Abstract loyalty to a crown, backed by religious doctrine and administered by a growing bureaucracy. Sweden followed a similar path, though more chaotically. The Yngling dynasty collapsed into civil wars that lasted generations. Brothers murdered brothers. Uncles betrayed nephews. Entire bloodlines were wiped out in single battles. But from this chaos emerged something the Vikings had never possessed: centralized state power. The change went deeper than politics. Viking society had operated on personal relationships. Loyalty earned through success, leadership proven through courage. The new kingdoms demanded something different: obedience to abstract authority. A king you might never see. Laws written by clerks you would never meet. Taxes collected by officials who owed you nothing and feared you not at all. This wasn't just a change in government. It was a fundamental alteration in how power worked. Viking leaders had to earn loyalty constantly through successful raids, generous gift-giving, and personal charisma. Kings inherited loyalty automatically and maintained it through force and ideology rather than performance. The transformation created new kinds of violence. Viking raids had been brutal but limited. Get in, take what you could carry, get out. Royal consolidation was different, systematic, permanent, designed to eliminate resistance rather than simply overcome it. Entire settlements were burned not for plunder, but to send messages. Populations were relocated not for ransom, but to break old loyalties and create new ones. Denmark moved fastest down this path, largely because its geography made consolidation easier. The peninsula was small enough to control, and proximity to the Frankish kingdoms provided models for royal administration. By the 11th century, Danish kings were issuing laws, collecting regular taxes, and maintaining permanent military forces in ways that would have been impossible under the old Viking system. The Church provided crucial support for this transformation. Christian doctrine offered something Viking paganism never could: a justification for absolute obedience to authority. Kings ruled by divine right. Rebellion against the crown was rebellion against God. The personal loyalty that Vikings had given to successful war leaders was now redirected toward abstract concepts: crown, kingdom, faith, that could never die and never fail to live up to expectations. But the new system created new problems. Centralized kingdoms needed resources that scattered chiefdoms had never required. Permanent bureaucracies, standing armies, elaborate courts. The wealth that had once been distributed among successful Vikings now flowed upward toward royal treasuries and administrative apparatus. The result was a society that was simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than what had come before. Viking chieftains had been strong because they were close to their followers, constantly proving their worth. Kings were strong because they were distant from their subjects, insulated by bureaucracy and ideology. But this distance created vulnerabilities that would define Scandinavian politics for centuries. The constant threat of rebellion, the endless need to demonstrate power through violence, the paranoid surveillance of potential rivals. By 1200, the transformation was essentially complete. The age of Viking raids was a memory. The age of royal absolutism had begun. The longships rotted on the beaches while kings built castles and monasteries, tax systems and law codes. The warriors who had once sailed freely across the Baltic now knelt in stone churches, listening to priests explain why obedience to earthly authority was a path to heavenly salvation. The Vikings were dead. The kings were just beginning. In 1397, 3 crowns became one. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were united under Queen Margaret I in what chroniclers called the Kalmar Union. The ceremony was magnificent. Nobles from across Scandinavia gathered to witness the birth of a Nordic superpower that would stretch from Greenland to the Baltic. The reality was more sinister. This wasn't a union of equals, but a Danish conquest disguised as diplomacy. The mechanics of control were straightforward. Danish administrators replaced local officials. Danish law superseded traditional customs. Danish taxes drained wealth southward, away from Swedish and Norwegian communities that would never see it again. What looked like unity from a distance was actually the systematic subordination of 2 kingdoms to a third. Margaret understood that successful domination required more than military force. She deployed marriage alliances, economic incentives, and careful distribution of offices to create a Swedish and Norwegian nobility that owed their positions to Danish favor. This wasn't just political control, it was the construction of a collaborator class that would enforce Danish interests in their own territories. The system worked for a while. Swedish nobles found themselves wealthier and more powerful under Danish rule than they had been as independent lords. Danish administrative efficiency created opportunities for trade and development that scattered Swedish kingdoms had been unable to achieve. The price was sovereignty, but sovereignty had never paid as well as collaboration. But the collaboration required constant maintenance. Danish kings needed to keep their Swedish and Norwegian subjects prosperous enough to remain loyal, but not powerful enough to become independent. This balancing act created a perpetual tension that would define the Union for over a century. The first crack appeared in 1434, when a Swedish mine inspector named Engelbrektsson launched a rebellion that revealed the depth of resentment simmering beneath the surface of Danish rule. Engelbrecht's revolt wasn't driven by noble ambition or dynastic claims. It emerged from the fury of ordinary Swedes who had watched Danish officials drain their communities while offering nothing in return. The rebellion succeeded. Briefly, Danish bailiffs fled or were killed. Swedish peasants and minor nobles joined forces to expel foreign administrators and reclaim local control. But success created its own problems. Independent Swedish nobles had little in common with independent Swedish peasants, and once the Danish threat was removed, they turned on each other. This pattern, successful rebellion followed by Swedish civil war, repeated throughout the Union period. Swedish unity existed only in opposition to Danish control. Remove that external pressure, and Sweden fragmented into competing factions that Danish diplomacy could exploit and manipulate. The Danes learned from each rebellion. Rather than ruling through brute force, they perfected techniques of indirect control. Danish-appointed archbishops controlled the Swedish church. Danish merchants dominated Swedish trade. Danish law governed Swedish disputes. Sweden remained technically independent, but every institution that mattered was staffed by Danish appointees or Swedish collaborators who owed their positions to Danish favor. The economic dimension of this control was particularly effective. The Union created a single market that benefited Danish merchants disproportionately. Swedish copper and iron flowed south to Danish ports. Norwegian timber and fish were processed in Danish cities. The profits from Scandinavian resources accumulated in Copenhagen, while the communities that produced those resources saw their wealth extracted and their young men conscripted for Danish wars. By 1500, the system had created two different Scandinavias. Denmark proper had become a prosperous, centralized kingdom with efficient institutions and growing international influence. Sweden and Norway were extractive colonies disguised as partner kingdoms, their resources systematically drained to fund Danish ambitions that offered them no benefit. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but Danish success created Danish ambition. King Christian II, who inherited the Union crown in 1513, was not content with the careful balance his predecessors had maintained. He wanted to transform the informal Danish dominance into explicit Danish supremacy, and he was willing to use terror to achieve it. Christian's mistake was assuming that a century of Danish rule had broken Swedish resistance permanently. The elaborate system of collaboration and extraction his predecessors had built looked stable from Copenhagen, but it depended on Swedish nobles believing they had more to gain from cooperation than from rebellion. Christian's increasingly aggressive policies began to shift that calculation. The Swedish nobility had grown wealthy under Danish rule, but they had not grown stupid. They could see that Christian's vision of the Union left no room for Swedish autonomy, even the limited autonomy they had enjoyed under previous Danish kings. The choice was becoming clear: submit completely or rebel completely. The crisis came to a head in Stockholm in 1520, when Christian II decided to resolve the Swedish question once and for all. He would gather the Swedish nobility together for a celebration of unity. What actually happened would be remembered as the Stockholm bloodbath, and it would destroy the Kalmar Union as effectively as any Swedish army. The Union had lasted 123 years, but its destruction would be accomplished in 3 days of systematic murder that revealed the violence underlying all the diplomatic niceties. The Danish crown of chains was about to be shattered by Danish blood. November 1520. The great hall of Stockholm Castle blazed with torchlight and echoed with laughter. 82 men, the most powerful nobles, bishops, and merchants in Sweden, raised their cups in celebration of Christian II's coronation as King of Sweden. The Danish monarch had promised amnesty. He had sworn peace. For 3 days, the feast continued in an atmosphere of reconciliation and hope. The doors were locked on the 4th morning. What followed was not warfare. It was surgery, the systematic removal of an entire political class through calculated terror. Christian II had not convened a celebration. He had constructed a trap. The Stockholm bloodbath would become the single most infamous act of political terrorism in Nordic history, a masterpiece of betrayal that would transform the Swedish psyche forever. The mechanics were straightforward. Christian II had retaken Sweden through military force, crushing the regent Sten Sture the Younger's resistance after a brutal campaign. But military victory was temporary. The Swedish nobility remained intact, their regional power bases undamaged, their capacity for future rebellion undiminished. Christian understood that occupying Stockholm meant nothing if Sweden's natural leaders remained alive to organize resistance from their provincial strongholds. The coronation feast solved this problem with elegant brutality. By guaranteeing safe conduct and promising amnesty, Christian lured his enemies into a single location where they could be eliminated en masse. The invitations went out to every significant Swedish leader. Archbishop Gustaf Troller's supporters provided the guest list. They came willingly, believing Christian's promises of reconciliation represented a genuine desire for peace. The legal pretext was heresy. On November 8th, as the guests sobered from 3 days of revelry, a tribunal convened under the authority of Archbishop Gustaf Troller. The charges were specific. The Swedish nobles had supported the expulsion of Troller from his archbishopric in 1517, an act that constituted rebellion against the Holy Roman Church. Under canon law, this made them heretics. Under Christians' interpretation of canon law, this made them subject to immediate execution. The trials were theatre. Gustaf Troller presided over proceedings where guilt was predetermined and defense impossible. The accused were not permitted to speak on their own behalf. No evidence was presented beyond their known opposition to Troller's authority. The sentences, death by beheading or hanging, were pronounced in batches with the efficiency of an administrative procedure. The executions began at dawn on November the 9th in Stortorget, Stockholm's main square. The scaffold had been constructed during the night. Christian II positioned himself at a window overlooking the square, ensuring his presence was visible to both the condemned and the crowds forced to witness the spectacle. This was not merely about eliminating political opponents. It was about demonstrating the absolute futility of resistance. The killing followed a deliberate hierarchy. The highest-ranking nobles died first, by beheading, a recognition of their aristocratic status even in death. Bishop Matthias of Strängnäs, regarded as the intellectual leader of Swedish resistance, was among the first to mount the scaffold. His execution sent a clear message. Neither noble blood nor religious office provided protection from Christians' justice. Lower-ranking nobles and prominent citizens followed, many meeting their end on the gallows. The executions continued through the day and into the next, with methodical precision that transformed mass murder into administrative routine. Bodies were left hanging as a warning, their decomposition serving as a constant reminder of the price of defiance. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Christian had not simply eliminated his enemies, he had demonstrated the complete worthlessness of Swedish traditions of honor, safe conduct, and aristocratic privilege. The most powerful men in Sweden, guaranteed protection by royal oath, had been slaughtered like animals after being lured into captivity through trust. If these leaders could be butchered with such casual betrayal, what protection could lesser nobles or common citizens expect? The strategic calculation was precise. By eliminating Sweden's entire leadership class in a single stroke, Christian created a political vacuum that only his appointed administrators could fill. The provincial strongholds that had sustained decades of rebellion were left leaderless, their traditional authority structures decapitated. Swedish resistance, which had operated through established networks of noble families and regional alliances, found itself without coordination or command. The religious justification served multiple purposes beyond providing legal cover. By framing the massacre as divine justice against heretics, Christian presented himself as God's instrument rather than a foreign tyrant. The involvement of Archbishop Trolle, a Swede, gave the proceedings a veneer of legitimacy, while demonstrating that collaboration with Danish authority brought rewards. The heresy charges also implied that opposition to Christian was opposition to God himself. But terror as statecraft carried inherent risks. The Stockholm bloodbath achieved its immediate objective of destroying organized Swedish leadership. Yet it also created something far more dangerous: a unified national hatred focused entirely on Christian II and Danish rule. The massacre's very completeness ensured that every surviving Swedish family of significance had lost fathers, brothers, or sons to Christian's executioners. Among the few who escaped was a young nobleman whose father had died in Stortorget's blood-soaked snow. Gustav Eriksson Vasa fled Stockholm, carrying news of the massacre to Sweden's remote provinces. He found audiences primed for rebellion not by political calculation, but by an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. Christian II's surgical strike had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for the very uprising it was designed to prevent. The bloodbath's true horror lay not in its scale. 82 deaths were modest by the standards of medieval warfare, but in its nature. This was not the chaos of battle or the heat of conquest, but the cold implementation of political theory through mass murder. Christian II had reduced statecraft to its essential elements: the systematic elimination of opposition through betrayal, legal fiction, and public terror. The spectacle in Stortorget demonstrated that Danish rule rested not on legitimacy, tradition, or consent, but purely on the capacity for violence. Christian had torn away every pretense of medieval kingship's moral foundation, revealing the naked reality of power exercised through fear. In doing so, he had created not a pacified province, but a nation united by trauma and dedicated to revenge. The young man who fled Stockholm in November 1520 carried more than news of massacre. He bore the crystallized rage of a traumatized nation. Gustav Eriksson Vasa had witnessed His father's execution in Stortorget seen Sweden's entire political elite butchered like livestock, and understood that Christian II's terror had eliminated every alternative to absolute resistance. The Stockholm bloodbath had not crushed Swedish independence. It had forged the man who would create modern Sweden through pure, methodical hatred. Gustav's War of Liberation began in the forests of Dalarna, among the mining communities and peasant villages that had escaped Christian's immediate attention. Here, the memory of the bloodbath served as recruitment propaganda more effective than any appeal to abstract nationalism. Gustav did not need to convince the Dalecarlians to fight. He needed only to describe what he had witnessed in Stockholm's main square. The systematic execution of Sweden's leadership had transformed rebellion from political choice to existential necessity. The early phases of Gustav's campaign revealed the bloodbath's strategic backfire. Christian II had eliminated Sweden's traditional military leadership, but he had also destroyed the very class most likely to compromise with foreign rule. The surviving resistance drew its strength from social groups with no stake in accommodation: miners who worked Sweden's silver deposits, farmers who had never seen Stockholm, foresters who knew every path through the northern wilderness. These were men who could not be bought, negotiated with, or intimidated by the spectacle of aristocratic heads rolling in town squares. Gustav understood that his rebellion represented more than dynastic change or political reform. The bloodbath had demonstrated that coexistence with Danish rule meant accepting the permanent possibility of betrayal and mass murder. Christian II had proven that Swedish nobles, no matter how cooperative, would always remain potential threats requiring elimination. The logic of terror admitted no middle ground between complete submission and total resistance. The military campaign that followed was less conventional warfare than national uprising. Gustav's forces operated through intimate knowledge of Swedish terrain and complete support from local populations. Danish garrisons found themselves isolated in hostile territory, their supply lines constantly severed, their movements shadowed by enemies who disappeared into familiar forests. Christian's troops could hold fortified positions, but they could not control the countryside that sustained Swedish resistance. The siege of Stockholm in 1523 marked the culmination of Gustav's systematic reconquest. The Danish garrison, cut off from reinforcement and surrounded by a population that remembered the bloodbath's horror, faced the choice between surrender and starvation. When the city finally opened its gates, Gustav entered not as a conqueror, but as an avenger, returning to the scene of his father's murder. The contrast was deliberate. Where Christian had entered through betrayal and massacre, Gustav arrived through Swedish invitation and Danish capitulation. Gustav's coronation as King Gustav I in 1523 represented more than successful rebellion. The ceremony took place in Stockholm, in sight of Stortorget, where his father had died 3 years earlier. This was not coincidence, but calculated symbolism. The new Swedish state was being born directly from the trauma of the bloodbath, its legitimacy derived from vengeance rather than tradition. Gustav had transformed his personal loss into national liberation, his individual rage into collective identity. The administrative structure Gustav created reflected the bloodbath's lessons about power and survival. Having witnessed how Christian II had exploited Sweden's decentralized feudal system to eliminate regional leaders en masse, Gustav constructed a ruthlessly centralized monarchy that eliminated the autonomy that had made the massacre possible. Swedish nobles would never again possess the independent power bases that had made them targets for foreign elimination, because such power bases would no longer exist. Gustav's approach to royal authority was shaped by his understanding of terror's effectiveness. He had seen how quickly Sweden's seemingly powerful elite had crumbled when faced with systematic violence. This experience taught him that stability required not the consent of the governed, but their conviction that resistance was futile. Gustav did not rule through fear in Christian's manner, but he ensured that royal power remained absolute and unchallenged. The economic policies of Gustav's reign demonstrated how the bloodbath had influenced his conception of statecraft. Christian II had destroyed Sweden's traditional leadership class, creating a political vacuum that Gustav filled with royal appointees answerable only to the crown. The great noble families that had dominated medieval Sweden were either extinct, their heads decorating Christian scaffolds, or reduced to ceremonial irrelevance. Gustav redistributed their power to administrators whose authority derived entirely from royal favor. The religious revolution Gustav initiated served multiple purposes beyond theological reform. By breaking with Rome and establishing a national Lutheran church, Gustav eliminated the external authority that had provided Christian II with legal justification for the bloodbath's heresy charges. Swedish Christianity would answer to Stockholm, not Rome, ensuring that no future foreign monarch could weaponize religious law against Swedish independence. Gustav's approach to succession planning reflected his awareness that the Swedish crown's survival depended on maintaining the centralized power structure the bloodbath had made necessary. His son Erik would inherit not just royal title, but the complete administrative apparatus Gustav had constructed to prevent the fragmentation that had enabled Christian's massacre. The Vasa dynasty represented institutionalized vengeance, a royal house whose very existence stood as monument to Danish betrayal. The transformation Gustav achieved was total. The Sweden that emerged from his reign bore no resemblance to the decentralized kingdom Christian II had conquered. Regional autonomy had been eliminated. Noble independence had been crushed. Royal authority had become absolute. The scattered feudal state that had proven so vulnerable to foreign manipulation had been replaced by a unified, centralized monarchy capable of defending itself through overwhelming internal control. Gustav Vasa's legacy was not liberation but reconstruction. He had not simply expelled Danish occupiers, he had created an entirely new form of Swedish state designed to ensure that the Stockholm bloodbath could never be repeated. His monarchy was forged in the fires of mass murder, tempered by the necessity of preventing future betrayal, and shaped by the understanding that survival required absolute centralization of power. The irony was complete. Christian II's masterpiece of terror, designed to eliminate Swedish resistance through the surgical removal of its leadership, had instead created the most effective Swedish leader in history. The bloodbath had not pacified Sweden. It had given birth to the modern Swedish state through the crucible of national trauma and the driving force of methodical revenge. When Gustav Vasa declared Sweden's independence from the Catholic Church in 1527, he stood before the Diet of Västerås with a proposition that had nothing to do with salvation. The assembled nobles heard not the call of theological conscience, but the sound of gold and silver being counted. The Reformation in Scandinavia was not a spiritual awakening. It was the largest asset seizure in Nordic history. The mechanics were straightforward. For centuries, the Catholic Church had accumulated vast holdings across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Monasteries owned entire counties. Cathedral chapters controlled trade routes. The Archbishop of Uppsala possessed estates that rivaled those of the greatest nobles. In a single legislative stroke, Gustav Vasa transferred this immense wealth directly to the crown. The king became overnight the largest landowner in Sweden, his treasury swollen with centuries of accumulated church riches. This was not reformation. This was confiscation with theological cover. The Danish king Frederick I executed an identical seizure across his domains. Norwegian bishops watched their lands pass to Copenhagen bureaucrats. Danish monasteries emptied as their endowments flowed into royal coffers. The Norwegian church, already weakened by its subordination to Denmark, found itself stripped of any remaining independence. What had been an international institution answering to Rome became a department of the Danish state. The transformation reached beyond mere economics. By breaking with Rome, the Scandinavian monarchs eliminated the only institutional power capable of challenging their authority. Catholic canon law had provided a parallel legal system. Papal authority had offered an alternative to royal command. Church courts had protected certain categories of people from secular punishment. These checks on royal power vanished with the stroke of a pen. The Lutheran doctrine that replaced Catholicism served the needs of absolute monarchy perfectly. Where Catholic teaching had maintained that temporal and spiritual authority derived from separate sources, Lutheran doctrine proclaimed that earthly rulers were placed by God and that resistance to royal authority constituted resistance to divine will. The Swedish Church's new catechism taught children that obedience to the king was a religious duty, that questioning royal commands was sinful, that the social order itself reflected God's plan. But the true genius of the Scandinavian Reformation lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it created. The confiscated church infrastructure did not disappear. Instead, it was repurposed as an instrument of state control more comprehensive than anything medieval Europe had known. The parish system that had served Catholic spiritual needs became the skeleton of a surveillance apparatus that would monitor every aspect of Scandinavian life. Every village church became an outpost of royal authority. Every priest transformed from a servant of Rome into an agent of the crown. The pulpit that had once proclaimed universal Christian messages now delivered sermons written to serve dynastic interests. Sunday services became exercises in political conditioning. The Church of Sweden was not a religious institution that happened to serve the state. It was a state agency that happened to employ religious language. The appointment system made this relationship explicit. Where Catholic bishops had been confirmed by Rome, Lutheran bishops received their authority directly from the king. Parish priests answered not to distant religious superiors, but to local secular administrators. The chain of command ran from village pulpit to royal palace with no external interruption. When a Swedish or Danish priest spoke, he spoke with the voice of the state. The theological implications were profound. God had been nationalized. The universal Catholic Church had proclaimed a message that transcended political boundaries, that spoke the same Latin words from Ireland to Poland. The new Lutheran churches preached in vernacular languages, but their message served vernacular interests. The God who spoke in Swedish churches wanted Swedes to obey Swedish kings. The God who spoke in Danish churches demanded Danish loyalty. Divine authority had been fragmented into pieces that matched political maps. This religious nationalism created populations psychologically prepared for the total control that would follow. Where medieval peasants had maintained some conceptual separation between earthly and spiritual authority, their Lutheran descendants learned to see royal power as sacred. Resistance became not merely illegal, but blasphemous. The Swedish farmer who questioned tax assessments was not just defying his king, but offending his God. The financial benefits of the Reformation funded the military expansion that would soon drench Europe in blood. The seized church estates provided the economic foundation for Sweden's imperial ambitions. The confiscated Danish monastery gold paid for the armies that would ravage Germany during the 30 Years' War. The wealth that had been accumulated across centuries for charitable and spiritual purposes was redirected toward conquest and slaughter. Yet the most lasting consequence of the Scandinavian Reformation was neither financial nor military, but psychological. The generations that grew up under the new religious order learned to associate divine will with royal command, to see dissent as sinful, to accept surveillance as spiritual necessity. They became the raw material for the total surveillance system that would soon envelop every aspect of Nordic life. When Gustav Vasa died in 1560, he left his sons not merely a kingdom, but a population that had been conditioned to accept unlimited royal authority as God's will. The Reformation had accomplished what no amount of military force could achieve. It had conquered the Scandinavian soul. The knock on Erik Johansson's door came every October, as regular as the harvest. The year was 1643, and in his small village outside Uppsala, the annual husförhör was beginning. When Erik opened his door, he faced not just his parish priest, but the embodiment of a surveillance system more comprehensive than anything the medieval world had imagined. What appeared to be a religious visit was actually an interrogation by the Swedish state. The priest carried with him a thick ledger, its pages marked with columns and careful notations. This was not a book of prayers, but a database of human souls, a detailed accounting of every resident in the parish. As Erik's family gathered in their main room, they prepared for an examination that would probe not only their religious knowledge, but their political loyalty, their moral behavior, and their usefulness to the crown. The husförhör, household examination, had evolved from simple catechism instruction into Europe's first systematic surveillance state. Every autumn, parish priests across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway conducted these sessions in every home within their jurisdiction. No dwelling was too poor, no family too insignificant to escape examination. The Swedish Church had created a monitoring system that reached into every corner of Nordic society. The questioning began with religious instruction. Erik's children recited Luther's small catechism, demonstrated their ability to read scripture, and answered theological questions that had been standardized across the realm. But the examination did not end with matters of faith. The priest recorded who was living in the household, their ages, their occupations, their relationships. He noted births, deaths, marriages, and movements. He assessed each family member's moral character, their attendance at church services, their compliance with religious and secular law. This information flowed upward through an administrative hierarchy that connected village parsonages to royal bureaucracy. Local priests submitted annual reports to regional superintendents, who compiled summaries for bishops, who provided comprehensive accounts to the crown. The Swedish state possessed detailed knowledge of its population that would not be equaled elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The priest examining Erik's family was simultaneously a religious figure and a government agent. His theological training included instruction in record-keeping, population monitoring, and loyalty assessment. The salary he received came not from voluntary donations, but from state-mandated tithes collected by royal tax farmers. His authority derived not from spiritual calling, but from bureaucratic appointment. When he spoke in Erik's home, he spoke with the voice of the Swedish crown. The questions probed beyond religious orthodoxy into political reliability. Did the family support the king's wars? Had they contributed adequately to military levies? Did they express proper enthusiasm for royal proclamations? The priest noted any signs of discontent, any expressions of doubt about government policies, any indication that this household might harbor subversive thoughts. Loyalty to the crown was assessed alongside knowledge of the Lord's Prayer. Those who failed the examination faced consequences that extended beyond spiritual matters. Families found religiously deficient could be barred from communion, a punishment that carried devastating social implications. Without access to the sacraments, individuals could not marry legally, conduct business with other believers, or participate in community life. Religious excommunication meant social death, but the surveillance system's reach extended beyond punishment into reward. Families that demonstrated exceptional religious knowledge and political loyalty found themselves favored for government positions, military commissions, and economic opportunities. The parish examination became a tool for identifying and cultivating supporters of the royal agenda. The Swedish state used religious orthodoxy as a test for political reliability. The records maintained by this system provided the crown with capabilities that medieval rulers could never have imagined. When military conscription was needed, the parish registers revealed which households contained young men of fighting age. When taxes were assessed, the detailed population records ensured that no one escaped royal accounting. When political dissent emerged, the loyalty evaluations helped identify potential troublemakers before they could organize resistance. The psychological impact of annual examination created a population conditioned to accept unlimited scrutiny. Swedish families learned that privacy was not a right, but a privilege that could be revoked at any time. Children grew up understanding that their thoughts, their beliefs, and their associations were subject to regular official review. The expectation of surveillance became so normalized that most people could not imagine any alternative arrangement. The system's religious camouflage made resistance nearly impossible. Opposition to the household examinations could be characterized as opposition to Christian instruction, rebellion against God's appointed ministers, rejection of spiritual guidance. The Lutheran doctrine that had made royal authority sacred also made royal surveillance holy. To resist the priest's questions was to resist divine will. The parish examination system created detailed knowledge that enabled increasingly sophisticated forms of control. Royal administrators could identify regions where religious instruction was succeeding or failing, adjust policies based on population trends, and track the effectiveness of various forms of indoctrination. The Swedish state developed what amounted to scientific methods for managing human compliance. By 1650, the household examination system had created a population that was not merely obedient, but transparent. Swedish subjects lived their lives knowing that their most intimate thoughts and behaviors would be subject to annual official review. They raised their children to expect scrutiny, to accept surveillance, to understand that service to the state was service to God. When Erik Johansson closed his door after that October examination in 1643, he sent his family back to their daily tasks with the knowledge that they had passed another test of worthiness. But the priest's ledger contained more than religious assessment. It held a complete inventory of human resources available to the Swedish crown, catalogued and evaluated with bureaucratic precision. The surveillance state had been born in the name of salvation, but its purpose was control. The parish had become a prison, with walls built from religious obligation and bars forged from divine command. The enemy came without armies, without banners, without warning. It arrived in the form of a killing frost on June the 15th, 1601. turning ripening grain fields across southern Sweden into blackened stubble. By morning, what had promised to be a decent harvest lay destroyed. This was not unusual weather. This was the new reality. The Little Ice Age had settled over northern Europe like a curse, transforming Scandinavia into a battleground where the primary combatant was winter itself. From the late 16th century onward, temperatures dropped by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, enough to shorten growing seasons by weeks, to freeze rivers that had flowed freely for generations, to turn marginal farmland into frozen wasteland. For societies that lived perpetually on the edge of subsistence, this climatic shift represented an existential threat more devastating than any human army. The frost became the region's most reliable killer, more efficient than war, more persistent than plague. It struck without negotiation, without mercy, and without regard for the grand ambitions of kings who dreamed of empire while their subjects battled starvation. The mechanics of survival became brutally simple. Spring planting moved later as late frosts destroyed early crops. Summer temperatures failed to reach levels necessary for proper grain maturation. Autumn arrived weeks early, cutting short the already abbreviated growing season. Winter extended its grip, consuming stored food reserves that were already inadequate for the shortened harvest. Swedish and Finnish peasants developed an intimate knowledge of disaster. They learned to read the subtle signs that marked the difference between mere hardship and catastrophic famine. A frost in early June meant bark bread by February. A wet, cold summer meant watching children grow hollow-cheeked before Christmas. An early autumn freeze meant death, walking through villages, selecting victims with methodical precision. The climate had fundamentally altered the terms of existence. Previous generations had faced occasional bad harvests, followed by recovery years. The Little Ice Age eliminated recovery. One failed harvest followed another in relentless succession. The margin between survival and death, already thin in the harsh northern environment, disappeared entirely. Agricultural records from the period paint a stark picture. In normal years, a hectare of land might yield 4 to 5 times the seed planted. During the worst Little Ice Age years, peasants harvested less grain than they had planted. The mathematics of survival became impossible. Even consuming the seed grain meant only postponing starvation until the following year brought no crop at all. The cold reshaped daily existence in ways that extended far beyond agriculture. Rivers froze earlier and thawed later, disrupting transportation and trade. The Baltic Sea, Scandinavia's primary commercial highway, became unreliable as ice blocked ports for extended periods. Timber, the region's most valuable export, became harder to transport as waterways remained frozen well into what should have been the shipping season. Indoor temperatures dropped to levels that made basic activities dangerous. Ink froze in the middle of writing. Wine froze solid in cellars. The elderly and infants died simply from the cold, even inside houses. Fuel consumption soared as desperate families burned furniture, fencing, and eventually parts of their homes to generate heat. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical hardship. Communities that had maintained traditions of mutual support began to fracture under the relentless pressure. Hospitality became a luxury few could afford when feeding an extra mouth meant torture. Condemning someone in your own family to starvation. Social bonds, religious faith, and basic human decency all proved vulnerable to sustained hunger and cold. The Swedish state's response revealed the fundamental disconnect between imperial ambitions and demographic reality. While King Charles XI expanded the military and pursued expensive foreign adventures, his subjects engaged in a desperate annual struggle for basic survival. Tax collectors continued their rounds even during famine years, extracting resources from communities where people were dying of starvation. Local administrators sent increasingly desperate reports to Stockholm, describing conditions that bordered on apocalyptic. Entire parishes abandoned, villages where half the population had died, regions where survivors lacked the strength to bury their dead. The central government acknowledged these reports with bureaucratic efficiency and continued demanding the same tax revenues. The climate created a demographic nightmare that would persist for generations. Chronic malnutrition weakened immune systems, making populations vulnerable to diseases that would have been survivable in normal circumstances. Birth rates plummeted as malnourished women became infertile or bore children too weak to survive infancy. The population recovery that should have followed each crisis was prevented by the next crisis arriving before recovery could begin. Finnish territories bore the worst burden of this climatic warfare. Located at the northern edge of viable agriculture, Finland experienced the most severe temperature drops and the shortest growing seasons. What constituted a difficult year in southern Sweden became a catastrophic famine in Finland. The Swedish administration treated these recurring disasters as local administrative problems rather than symptoms of a fundamental crisis. The Little Ice Age transformed Scandinavian culture in profound ways. The Stoic fatalism that would later be identified as characteristically Nordic developed during these centuries of climatic assault, when survival depended entirely on factors beyond human control. Acceptance of suffering became a survival strategy. The Lutheran emphasis on divine will aligned perfectly with this environmental determinism. This was the context in which the Swedish Empire pursued its dreams of greatness. While diplomats negotiated territorial expansion and generals planned military campaigns, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. Scandinavia was locked in an unwinnable war against a climate that had turned hostile. The frost killed more Swedish subjects than all the empire's foreign enemies combined, yet it remained the enemy that could neither be defeated nor negotiated with. The first sign of catastrophe appeared on May 30th, 1695, when frost killed the spring crops across eastern Finland. The second arrived in August, when early snow buried what little grain had survived the summer's abnormally cold temperatures. By October, when the final harvest yielded barely enough seed for the following year's planting, the mathematics of survival had become impossible. Finland was about to die. The Great Famine of 1695 to 1697 represented the Little Ice Age's most devastating assault on human civilization in the Nordic region. This was not merely a food shortage. This was the systematic collapse of an entire society, where approximately 1/3 of Finland's population, nearly 100,000 people, would perish in slow agony, while the Swedish state maintained its demands for taxes and military recruits. The progression followed a predictable pattern that had become grimly familiar during the Little Ice Age, but this time every stage intensified beyond previous experience. The failed harvest of 1695 forced families to consume their seed grain by winter, guaranteeing that 1696 would produce nothing. The barley and rye that formed the foundation of the Finnish diet simply disappeared. What followed was a descent into biological horror that transformed an entire population into walking skeletons. By January of 1696, Finnish peasants had exhausted their traditional famine foods. The bark bread that had sustained previous generations through difficult years required bark from pine, spruce, and birch trees mixed with what little grain remained. But with no grain reserves whatsoever, bark became the primary ingredient. Finnish families spent their days stripping trees bare, grinding the inner bark into a flour that provided no nutritional value and caused excruciating intestinal damage. The bark bread shredded digestive systems from the inside. Those who survived on it for weeks developed a characteristic hollow-eyed appearance, their bodies consuming muscle mass, while their stomachs distended from the indigestible fiber. Children who ate bark bread regularly died from intestinal blockages. Adults survived longer, but the constant internal bleeding left them weakened beyond recovery. As winter progressed, even bark became scarce. Finnish families turned to substances that previous generations would have considered inedible. Ground fish bones mixed with sawdust, leather boots and harnesses boiled into gelatinous soup, straw from thatched roofs. The desperation drove people to consume materials that hastened rather than delayed starvation. The Swedish administrative apparatus documented the famine's progression with bureaucratic precision. Tax collectors reported entire parishes where no one possessed the strength to attend church services. Local governors described villages where the living lacked the energy to bury the dead, leaving bodies to accumulate in houses until spring thaw made disposal possible. By summer 1696, social structures had completely collapsed across eastern Finland. The traditional mutual support networks that enabled communities to survive difficult years proved inadequate when everyone simultaneously faced starvation. Families began abandoning children they could no longer feed, leaving infants and elderly relatives in forests with the hope that death would come quickly. The wandering began in earnest during the second winter. Entire families left their homes to search for food, creating streams of refugees who moved from village to village, seeking sustenance that nowhere existed. These migration patterns spread typhus and other diseases through populations already weakened by malnutrition. The combination of starvation and epidemic disease accelerated the death toll beyond anything previously recorded in Scandinavian history. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that approached medieval visions of hell. Swedish officials reported discovering houses where entire families had died and remained undisturbed for months. Village churches became morgues as surviving residents dragged bodies inside to await mass burial. The few travelers who ventured into affected regions described landscapes populated only by skeletal figures who moved with the mechanical persistence of the dying. The psychological deterioration paralleled the physical collapse. Lutheran parish records document the breakdown of moral restraints that had traditionally governed Finnish society. Reports of cannibalism appeared with increasing frequency as the famine entered its second year. Families consumed the bodies of recently deceased relatives. Stronger individuals killed weaker neighbors for meat. The social contract that enabled civilized existence simply disintegrated. The Swedish government's response revealed the callous indifference of imperial administration to peripheral suffering. King Charles XI, preoccupied with military preparations against Denmark and Russia, treated the Finnish famine as a local administrative problem. Tax collection continued throughout the crisis. Military recruitment proceeded on schedule, drafting men who lacked the physical strength to carry weapons. Local Swedish administrators repeatedly requested emergency grain supplies from the southern provinces, but the central government prioritized military stockpiles over civilian relief. The few shipments that arrived proved woefully inadequate for the scale of the disaster. Most grain intended for famine relief was diverted to feed Swedish garrisons and administrative personnel, leaving Finnish civilians to subsist on whatever they could forage. The demographic catastrophe extended far beyond the immediate death toll. Chronic malnutrition rendered surviving women infertile, preventing population recovery for decades after the famine ended. Children who survived the crisis suffered permanent physical and cognitive damage from prolonged starvation. The birth rate collapsed so completely that some Finnish parishes recorded no births for entire years during the crisis. The famine's geographic pattern highlighted the imperial relationship between Sweden and Finland. The worst mortality occurred in eastern Finland, furthest from Swedish administrative centers and supply networks. Coastal regions with access to fish and trade routes experienced severe hardship, but avoided the complete societal collapse that characterized the interior. The Swedish core remained largely unaffected, while its Finnish periphery died. By late 1697, when normal harvests finally returned, the damage had become irreversible. Entire districts lay depopulated, their farms abandoned, and villages empty. The survivors, traumatized by experiences that had reduced them to animalistic behavior, struggled to reconstruct communities from the demographic wreckage. Many never recovered their pre-famine population levels. Church records from the period provide the most reliable documentation of the famine's impact. Parish after parish recorded mortality rates that approached 40% of the total population. Some communities lost more than half their residents. The surviving records read like casualty reports from a military campaign, except the enemy was hunger and cold rather than foreign armies. The Great Famine represented the logical conclusion of the Little Ice Age's assault on Scandinavian civilization. When climate, administrative indifference, and imperial priorities combined, the result was suffering on a scale that approached genocidal proportions. Finland had not merely experienced a food shortage. It had endured a systematic collapse that would shape its relationship with Swedish authority for generations to come. The Swedish Karelian soldier stood at morning inspection with his back straight and his musket polished to mirror brightness. His uniform bore no stains, his hair was properly powdered, and his catechism responses came without hesitation. When his captain asked him to recite the king's prayer, he delivered each word with the mechanical precision of a church bell. "O God, grant that I may die honorably for my king and country, that my soul may find salvation through service to your anointed sovereign." This was not mere military discipline. This was religious programming executed with industrial efficiency. By 1700, the Swedish state had perfected what medieval monarchs could only dream of: an army that worshipped death in battle as a sacrament. The Karelian forces that marched under Charles XII weren't simply well-trained soldiers. They were the ultimate products of the Lutheran surveillance system, men whose minds had been shaped from birth by the same parish examinations that monitored every household's theological compliance. The Husverhör had done its work. It had created warriors who believed their king was God's direct representative on earth, and that dying for him was identical to dying for Christ. The mechanics were straightforward. Every Karelian had been raised under the parish system's relentless oversight. From childhood, they had undergone annual examinations, testing not just their literacy and mathematical skills, but their religious orthodoxy and political loyalty. They had memorized Luther's small catechism, which explicitly commanded absolute obedience to earthly authority as divine commandment. They had learned that questioning the king was identical to questioning God, that desertion was not just military crime, but mortal sin. When these men reached military age, they entered an army that extended rather than replaced their religious indoctrination. Regimental chaplains conducted daily prayers emphasizing the sanctity of royal service. Military law incorporated theological doctrine, Cowardice wasn't merely punishable by court-martial. It was presented as apostasy that would damn the soul to hell. Battle orders were delivered as religious instruction. Officers reminded their men that Swedish soldiers who died fighting for their sovereign king would bypass purgatory entirely and ascend directly to heavenly glory. The results were tactically magnificent and psychologically horrifying. Carolean infantry advanced through cannon fire with the measured pace of a funeral march, maintaining formation even as grapeshot tore through their ranks. They absorbed casualties that would break other armies, not because they were braver, but because they had been conditioned to view their own deaths as acts of worship. When wounded Caroleans lay dying in the mud after battle, witnesses reported them reciting prayers of thanksgiving for the privilege of spilling their blood in royal service. This was not warrior culture in any traditional sense. Viking berserkers had fought with individual fury, driven by personal honor and the promise of Valhalla. The Caroleans fought with collective discipline, driven by systematic indoctrination and the promise of Christian salvation. Where ancient Germanic warriors had followed war leaders they chose, these men served a monarch they had been taught to regard as divinely appointed. Their loyalty wasn't earned through gift-giving or shared danger, but programmed through decades of religious surveillance and theological instruction. The Swedish officer corps understood exactly what they commanded. Training manuals from the period don't discuss motivation or morale in conventional military terms. Instead, they contain detailed instructions for maintaining religious discipline, how to conduct field services, how to frame tactical orders as divine commandments, how to present retreat as temporary testing of faith rather than military necessity. Officers were expected to function as battlefield priests, combining tactical leadership with theological guidance. Foreign observers found the Carolean system deeply unsettling. Russian generals who fought against Swedish forces reported that captured Carolean soldiers often seemed confused rather than defeated, as if they couldn't comprehend why God had allowed them to be taken prisoner instead of granted the martyrdom they expected. Danish officers noted that wounded Swedes frequently refused medical treatment, apparently believing that accepting help might diminish the spiritual merit of their suffering. Prussian military theorists studied Carolean discipline with fascination and horror, recognizing its effectiveness while questioning whether troops so thoroughly indoctrinated could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The answer became apparent during the Great Northern War itself. Carolean forces performed brilliantly in conventional battles where their programming aligned with tactical requirements. They could absorb enormous punishment, maintain formation under fire, and execute complex maneuvers with mechanical precision. But when faced with unconventional warfare, strategic retreat, or situations requiring independent judgment, their conditioning became a liability. They had been taught to die magnificently, not to think flexibly. Charles XII himself embodied the same systematic fusion of religious fanaticism and royal authority that defined his army. He conducted daily prayers before battle, presenting military campaigns as crusades undertaken at divine command. He refused to marry, claiming his kingdom was his bride and his soldiers his children. He slept on campaign cots and ate military rations, even in his palaces, demonstrating the ascetic discipline he demanded from his men. But this wasn't authentic religious devotion. It was performance art designed to reinforce the theological framework that made his army possible. The king had been raised under the same Lutheran orthodoxy that shaped his soldiers, but with additional layers of instruction, emphasizing his role as God's earthly representative. Court theologians had spent his childhood teaching him that royal authority wasn't political convenience, but cosmic responsibility. He genuinely believed that his military campaigns were divine missions, that Swedish defeats represented temporary trials of faith, and that ultimate victory was guaranteed by heavenly providence. This wasn't cynical manipulation. Charles XII was as thoroughly programmed as any common soldier, just with different software. When the Karelians marched east toward Russia in 1708, they carried with them not just weapons and supplies, but the accumulated weight of decades of religious surveillance, theological indoctrination, and systematic conditioning. They were no longer simply men serving their country. They were believers marching toward a sacred destiny, confident that either victory or death would vindicate their faith. The surveillance state had succeeded completely. It had created an army that viewed military service as religious obligation, that welcomed death as spiritual promotion, and that could not conceive of questioning their divine mission. What they marched toward was not triumph but catastrophe, not vindication but annihilation. The Russian winter was waiting, and it would test whether systematic indoctrination could withstand the reality of ice, starvation, and tactical disaster. The Swedish army that crossed into Russia in January 1708 numbered 43,000 men. When the remnants staggered back across the border 3 years later, fewer than 8,000 remained combat effective. This was not military defeat in any conventional sense. This was systematic annihilation, a meat grinder of ice and steel that consumed an entire generation of Swedish manpower and ended forever the Baltic Empire's claim to great power status. Charles XII had planned the Russian campaign as his masterstroke, the decisive blow that would force Peter the Great to accept Swedish dominance over the Baltic. The strategic concept appeared sound. Strike deep into Russian territory before winter, capture Moscow or St. Petersburg, and dictate terms from the enemy capital. His Karelian army was perfectly suited for this kind of rapid, aggressive warfare. Their discipline was legendary, their equipment was superior, and their religious programming had conditioned them to accept any hardship in service of their divine king. The Russians had different plans. Peter the Great had studied Swedish tactical methods for decades, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses. With the systematic approach he applied to all Western technology he sought to acquire and improve upon. He understood that Karelian discipline made them nearly invincible in conventional battle, but that same rigidity could become a fatal weakness under the right conditions. Instead of offering the decisive confrontation Charles XII expected, Peter implemented a strategy of systematic evasion, retreat deeper into Russian territory, destroy everything useful to an invading army, and let distance, weather, and logistics accomplish what direct battle could not. The Scorched Earth campaign began immediately. Russian forces withdrew systematically eastward, burning villages, destroying bridges, slaughtering livestock, and poisoning wells. Swedish supply lines stretched longer with each day's advance, while the promised decisive battle remained tantalizingly out of reach. Charles XII pressed forward with the relentless confidence of a man who believed Providence guaranteed his ultimate success. His soldiers followed with the programmed obedience of men who had been taught that questioning royal strategy was identical to questioning divine will. By autumn, the Swedish army was beginning to fracture. Karelian discipline could withstand enemy fire, but it was proving inadequate against hunger, disease, and the psychological strain of endless marching through devastated countryside. Desertion remained rare, the religious programming held firm, but effectiveness was declining as malnutrition and exhaustion took their toll. Officers reported that men were collapsing during marches, not from cowardice, but from physical breakdown. The systematic indoctrination that made them perfect soldiers was preventing them from making the rational decision to preserve themselves through strategic withdrawal. Winter arrived early and with unprecedented severity. The Great Frost of 1708 to 1709 brought temperatures that European armies had never experienced. Russian chroniclers recorded wine freezing solid inside heated buildings, trees exploding from internal ice pressure, and birds falling dead from the sky in mid-flight. For the Swedish army, caught in the open Ukrainian steppe without adequate winter quarters, it was a death sentence delivered with meteorological precision. The Karelians died with the same disciplined precision that had characterized their military service. They maintained formation even as frostbite claimed fingers and toes. They stood guard duty until they froze at their posts. They shared their dwindling rations according to military regulation, refusing to break ranks even when starvation was consuming their bodies. Officers found soldiers dead in perfect rows, having expired during the night without disturbing their sleeping comrades. The surveillance state's programming held firm even as its products turned to ice. Supply convoys stopped reaching the army entirely. Swedish forces began supplementing their diet with leather from boots and saddles, bark stripped from trees, and eventually with meat carved from horses too valuable to kill, until the animals died naturally from cold and exhaustion. Medical supplies had been exhausted months earlier. Wounded men died not from their injuries, but from infection and exposure, their bodies too weakened to fight off diseases that healthy soldiers could have survived easily. Charles XII himself seemed immune to the suffering around him. He continued conducting daily prayers of thanksgiving, presenting each day's survival as evidence of divine favor. He refused to consider retreat, apparently convinced that persistence would eventually be rewarded with miraculous intervention. His religious programming was so complete that he interpreted military disaster as spiritual testing, evidence that God was preparing him for ultimate triumph. While his soldiers died by thousands, he planned new offensives and dictated victory proclamations to be released after the anticipated breakthrough. The Battle of Poltava on July 8, 1709, was less military engagement than ritual sacrifice. The Swedish army that assembled for battle bore little resemblance to the force that had invaded Russia 18 months earlier. Disease, starvation, and combat had reduced their numbers to fewer than 20,000 effective troops. Many soldiers could barely carry their weapons. Officers reported men collapsing from exhaustion during the pre-battle formation, but they advanced anyway, maintaining their disciplined ranks with the mechanical precision that had been drilled into them through decades of training and indoctrination. The Russian artillery opened with devastating effect. Karelian infantry walked into concentrated cannon fire that tore through their formations like scythes through wheat. They closed ranks and continued advancing. Russian musketry opened at close range, dropping Swedish soldiers in rows. The survivors stepped over their fallen comrades and maintained their assault. For 2 hours, the Karelians demonstrated the ultimate effectiveness of their systematic conditioning, absorbing casualties that would have broken any normal army while continuing to execute their tactical assignments. When the Swedish formation finally collapsed, it was not from cowardice or loss of will, but from simple mathematics. There were no longer enough living men to maintain coherent units. The battle ended not with surrender, but with annihilation. Russian forces found Swedish positions littered with bodies arranged in perfect military formation, soldiers who had died at their posts rather than retreat without orders. Charles XII himself was wounded and fled the battlefield. but thousands of his followers had achieved the martyrdom their religious programming had promised them. The remnants of the Swedish army that managed to escape Poltava faced 12 more years of warfare. The Great Northern War continued until 1721, consuming Swedish resources and manpower with relentless efficiency. But the imperial dream had died in the Ukrainian mud. The surveillance state that had created Europe's most disciplined army had also created the conditions for its complete destruction. Men programmed to die for their king had done exactly that, carrying the Swedish Empire to its grave with systematic thoroughness. When Charles XII finally died in 1718, struck down while besieging a Norwegian fortress, he left behind a kingdom that had sacrificed everything for imperial glory and gained nothing but mass graves and collective trauma. The Carolean system had worked perfectly, producing soldiers so thoroughly conditioned that they had willingly marched into annihilation rather than question their divine mission. The price of that systematic perfection was the end of Swedish great power status and the beginning of a demographic catastrophe from which the nation would never fully recover. The Great Northern War stripped Scandinavia of its future. By 1721, when the Treaty of Nystad finally ended the carnage, Sweden and Finland had sacrificed approximately 200,000 soldiers, a demographic hemorrhage from which the region would never fully recover. These were not merely numbers in military ledgers. They represented an entire generation of young men who would never return to their farms, never father children, never rebuild what the war had consumed. The mathematics of destruction were straightforward. In a population of roughly 2 million, losing 200,000 adult males created a cascading social catastrophe. Entire parishes counted their surviving men on one hand. Villages that had sent 20 soldiers to Charles XII's armies welcomed back 2, if they were fortunate. The landscape filled with widows who had never been wives, children who would never know their fathers, and farms that lay fallow because no one remained to work them. This was not merely military defeat, it was national evisceration. The Lutheran parish records, those meticulous documents of surveillance and control, now became monuments to absence. Page after page listed the missing, the presumed dead, the men who had marched away with the Carolean columns and vanished into the Russian winter. The same system that had catalogued every citizen's movements now documented their disappearance. The social fabric unraveled in predictable patterns. Without male laborers, agricultural production collapsed further. Without young fathers, birth rates plummeted. The very demographic foundation of Swedish imperial ambitions crumbled, leaving behind a society fundamentally altered by loss. The surveillance state remained, but now it monitored a population traumatized into submission by catastrophe rather than ideology alone. The darkness of Scandinavian history lies not in mythic sagas of blood eagles and berserker fury, but in the methodical construction of systems designed to control human beings with surgical precision. From the Stockholm bloodbath to the parish surveillance networks, from the Little Ice Age famines to the demographic apocalypse of the Great Northern War, this was a civilization forged in the furnace of state terror and environmental hostility. The modern Nordic model, with its high taxes, powerful bureaucracies, and emphasis on social conformity, was not born from enlightened idealism. It emerged from centuries of brutal necessity, where survival demanded absolute state control and individual submission to collective authority. The famous Scandinavian aversion to military power stems directly from the trauma of watching an entire generation disappear into foreign wars. Today's Scandinavia, celebrated for its social welfare and institutional trust, rests on foundations built from the bones of those who died in the service of absolute kings and an unforgiving God. The darkness endures, transformed but never truly vanished. In every census taken, every tax collected, every citizen who accepts state authority as the price of survival in a hostile world.